39 men went down into the dark. Only 7 came back. What they saw wasn't rock or water, but a hungry, living shadow in the deepest blackness of the earth. August 3rd, 1925. Coalwood, West Virginia. A town built on black dust and the hopes of men who wrestled a living out of the mountainside. The Coalwood Mine was their whole world, a winding, miles-deep labyrinth of stone and timber that promised life but always carried the threat of death. On that sweltering summer morning, 39 miners clocked in, just like any other day, strapping on their lamps and saying quick, tired goodbyes to the sunlight and the fresh air, unaware that the mine was about to show them a secret it had kept for 1,000 years. The problem with the Coalwood Mine wasn't a sudden gas leak or a cheap wooden support beam finally giving way. The problem was the quiet. Everyone knew the mine had a sound, a constant low-level thrumming that was the heartbeat of the earth mixed with the noise of men working, the scrape of shovels, the thunk of pickaxes, the slow, straining cough of the machinery. But for 3 days leading up to August 3rd, the sound was wrong. It had started to pull back, to thin out, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and colder than any normal dark. The miners felt it on their skin, a creeping dread that was worse than the dust that choked their lungs. Old Man Hemlock, who had been in the earth since he was 10, swore he could hear a new sound mixed into the silence, something faint and wet that sounded like a huge, slow breath being taken far, far down one of the unmapped shafts, a sound that the rock should have swallowed up completely, but somehow didn't. Every man who went into the deeper, newer shafts felt like they were being watched by something that didn't have eyes, and this feeling, this cold, heavy psychological pressure, was their first unspoken problem, a challenge not against the rock, but against whatever ancient fear the rock itself was holding inside. It made their hands tremble and their lamps seem dimmer, and it made the walk down into the main shaft feel less like a shift at work and more like a forced march into a yawning, waiting throat. The cage dropped them down, 39 men packed together, the smell of sweat and lamp oil thick in the small space. When the doors opened, they stepped onto a floor of loose coal and mud, and the silence immediately wrapped around them. They were heading for Section 12, the deepest, darkest, and most profitable vein, where the coal lay thick and black, ready to be ripped out. The tunnel stretched out before them, a low-ceilinged, suffocating passage where the beams overhead dripped a constant cold water that wasn't quite clean, a place that felt utterly divorced from the world above, where the sun still shone and the birds still sang. Every single step they took made the darkness feel more alive, like they were trespassing on the sleep of something massive and old.
I want you to picture the air down there. It wasn't just stale, it was dead air, heavy with the scent of sulfur and wet earth, and something else, a strange metallic smell that no one could quite put their finger on, but which made the back of their throats sting and their stomachs feel uneasy. The heat was oppressive, but at the same time, strange, localized pockets of unnatural coldness would wash over them, making the hair stand up on their arms, a coldness that felt less like temperature and more like a warning. They walked single file, the only sound the crunch of their boots and the faint hiss of their carbide lamps trying to fight back the overwhelming, suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. The main crew chief, a man named Thomas, a mountain of a man who usually laughed and told loud jokes, was quiet that morning. He kept running his hand over the damp rock walls as they walked, a nervous habit no one had ever seen before. He was searching for something, checking for stress cracks maybe, or listening for the telltale groans of the rock settling, but his face was white under the coal dust. Around them, the mine felt like it was shifting and breathing in a way that wasn't normal. They passed side tunnels that looked suddenly deeper than they remembered, the shadows inside them moving in ways that their lamps should have been able to cut through, but somehow couldn't. About an hour into their shift, deep past the first-mile marker, the crew stopped. It was old Joe who noticed it first. Joe was a quiet man, always carrying a small wooden bird carved for him by his granddaughter, a strange comfort in the crushing darkness. He held up his hand, and the 39 men, a collective of heavy-breathing shadows, froze instantly. Joe pointed his lamp down the main track. The tracks were used to haul the coal cars, laid with heavy steel rails. But about 50 feet ahead, the two parallel lines of steel had been ripped apart. Not bent by a cave-in, not buckled by pressure. Ripped. It looked as if a colossal hand had simply grabbed the steel and twisted it until the bolts snapped, and the rail itself tore, leaving the sharp, jagged ends sticking out like broken teeth. This wasn't nature. This was force, raw and intelligent, and it completely defied the physics of a normal mine disaster. A murmur went through the group, a low, scared sound that was quickly shushed by Thomas. Gas pocket, maybe, Thomas tried, but his voice lacked conviction, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. They all knew better. A gas pocket explodes. It doesn't dismantle steel with surgical violence. They carefully worked their way around the damage, stepping over the fractured earth and the scattered debris, their lamps casting nervous, jumping circles of light that couldn't seem to hold the darkness back. As they moved on, the strange occurrences became less deniable. Tools were missing from where they had been stacked the day before. Large, smooth indentations, too wide to be human handprints, were pressed into the soft, muddy floor of the side tunnels, leading away into the impenetrable blackness. Then came the smell. It was the metallic scent again, but much stronger now, mixed with something utterly foul, something like spoiled meat and ozone, like the air right after lightning has struck. It was so strong that several of the younger miners gagged, pressing their hands over their mouths and noses to try and filter out the sickening, stomach-turning stench that hung heavy in the narrow passage. They finally reached Section 12, their designated working area. It was a huge, echoing chamber that had been carved out over the last 6 months, a massive, unsupported vault of rock that felt precarious and wrong. Thomas ordered them to start setting up the explosives for the day's blasting. The men worked with a forced, mechanical speed, trying to ignore the prickle on the back of their necks, the feeling that they were working inside a giant, watchful eye socket. It was young Billy, the lamp tender, who disappeared first. He was supposed to be checking the fuel levels in the carbide lamps at the far end of the section, a distance of about 200 feet from the main group. One minute, his small, bobbing light was there, a friendly, flickering beacon against the vast, dark wall. The next minute, it was gone. Not winked out, but swallowed. Thomas shouted his name, the sound of his voice echoing off the rock in a way that seemed to mock the panic in his chest.
"Billy, where are you? Answer me." Only the echo answered. A few of the men, including Thomas and Joe, grabbed their picks and started toward where Billy's light had been. They moved quickly, their fear pushing them forward. When they reached the spot, there was nothing. No body, no light, no sign of a struggle, just a small, perfectly round depression in the coal dust about the size of a dinner plate, and leading from it, a faint, smooth smear mark that stretched horizontally along the wall for about 10 feet before abruptly vanishing. The smear was wet, and when Thomas cautiously touched it with a gloved finger, he pulled his hand back,
staring at a thick, clear, odorless slime that clung to the leather. It was cold, unnaturally cold. Then they heard it. A noise that cut through the silence like a rusty saw blade. It was a high-pitched, wet, clicking sound, like 1,000 insects snapping their mandibles at once, but with a terrible, heavy bass note underneath it, a vibration that shook the very air in the chamber. And it was coming from the darkness beyond the wall, from the earth itself. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. 2 more men, the twin brothers Samuel and Eli, dropped their tools and started running back toward the main shaft entrance, screaming a prayer in Welsh. They didn't make it 10 steps before their screaming cut off suddenly and cleanly, like a radio being unplugged. The rest of the men heard a brief, sickening squelch, followed by the sound of something large dragging itself heavily over the loose rock. The only light in the chamber was from their own small lamps, and every man immediately turned his light to the spot where the brothers had been, the beams trembling wildly in their hands. There was nothing, just the silence again, heavier now, filled with the recent memory of the screams and the click, click, click of the unseen horror. Thomas, his face grim and covered in a fresh layer of sweat, knew the shift was over. This was not a work hazard. This was a hunter. "Everyone," he yelled, his voice hoarse, "back to the cage! Now! Move! Move! Move!" The retreat turned into a stampede. 36 men, shoulder to shoulder, running, slipping, and scrambling over the rough terrain, their carbide lamps bouncing and casting insane, spinning shadows that made the whole mine look like it was laughing at them. They didn't care about the coal or the paycheck or the foreman's wrath. They cared only about the small, circular opening of the main shaft, the only way back to the sun. But the creature, whatever it was faster. It used the darkness like a camouflage, a weapon. It seemed to anticipate their movements, moving through the unlit side tunnels parallel to their main path, cutting off the stragglers. The attacks were quick, silent, and horrifically effective. They heard a choked cry from the back, a sudden scuffle, and then a miner named David was simply pulled backwards into a narrow, dark side passage, his lamp tumbling away and shattering on the ground, leaving behind a small final splash of fuel. No one stopped to help him. They couldn't. Stopping meant joining him. The journey back was a nightmare of psychological terror. Every scraping sound was a claw. Every drip of water was the creature's drool. They ran for what felt like hours, their lungs burning, their bodies slick with sweat and fear, the air growing thick with the metallic, fouling stench that heralded the monster's presence. They knew it was stalking them, playing with them, hurting them. The monster wasn't limited to the ground. Up ahead, near a section of the tunnel where the ceiling was higher, the lamps of the lead group caught a glimpse of something moving above them. A vast, dark shape clinging to the arched rock ceiling like a colossal pale spider, only without the legs they could see. It was slick and wet, reflecting their lamp beams with a ghastly, oily sheen. It was massive, filling the entire width of the tunnel roof, and its movement was a sickening, slow ripple like a giant slug made of wet, rubbery shadow. It moved with unnatural silence, its sheer size seeming to defy the laws of gravity as it traversed the rough stone. One of the men, driven insane by the sight, screamed and fired his emergency blasting cap into the rock wall, a desperate, futile attempt to bring the tunnel down. The flash of the explosion lit up the creature for a split second, and what the men saw stole their breath and their sanity. It was mostly mouth, a huge, horizontal opening lined with rows upon rows of needle-thin teeth that looked translucent, almost like glass. There were no visible eyes, only patches of what looked like scarred, old white skin. The front end of the creature tapered into a blunt, rounded head, and from the sides of its body, thick, pale, almost rope-like tendrils extended and contracted,
feeling the air and the rock. The creature was a deep, mottled gray-white, the color of things that live their entire lives without ever seeing the light. A biological engine designed only for consumption in the total darkness.
The sheer impossible size of it, the length of a small train car, caused the miners' minds to break. Many simply stopped running, paralyzed by a sight that no human mind was equipped to process. Thomas, galvanized by the horror, grabbed the nearest man and shoved him forward. "Don't look at it! Run! Look at your feet! Run!" The creature dropped, not onto the path, but slightly ahead, using its enormous body to block the main exit. It didn't rush. It simply settled, its wet, heavy bulk crushing the wooden supports instantly, the sound of the cracking timber adding a fresh note of terror to the scene. The awful wet clicking sound intensified, filling the enclosed space with a sound that was less an audible noise and more of vibration in the bones. The miners were trapped between the mouth and the cage. They were dying, but they weren't going to die easily. 25 of them, driven by a final desperate surge of adrenaline, turned and charged, wielding their pickaxes and shovels, the only weapons they had against a nightmare made real. It was a pointless, doomed attack, a final act of human defiance against an alien horror. What happened next was a chaotic, bloody mess that the 7 survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The creature didn't fight back in a recognizable way. It simply consumed. One miner was caught by a pale tendril that whipped out with impossible speed, wrapping around his chest and in one swift crushing movement, snapping his spine. Another fell into the massive open maw, disappearing instantly with a sound like a wet boot being pulled from mud. The air filled with shrieks, the grinding sound of bone, and the overwhelming metallic stench of fresh blood, now mixing with the ozone and decay. Thomas, fighting on instinct, realized he couldn't beat the monster, but he could distract it. He jammed his pickaxe into the creature's side, not drawing blood, but merely sinking into the rubbery, tough skin a few inches before the handle was ripped from his grasp. The attack drew the creature's attention, its immense body shifting its focus entirely onto him, an act that saved the 7 men behind him. The 7 survivors, Joe, a young lad named Caleb, and 5 others, didn't look back. They scrambled through a small, abandoned maintenance crawl space that they had almost passed, a space too small for the monstrous thing to follow. They crawled in the dark, not daring to use their lamps, pulling themselves through the tight, choking passage, the sounds of the massacre echoing behind them, the monstrous clicks, the tearing, the choked cries of their friends. They crawled until their knees bled and their arms were numb, until the terrible sounds began to fade into a hollow, oppressive silence, finally finding a disused emergency ladder shaft that led straight up. They climbed, desperate, for nearly an hour, their last shreds of energy fueled by pure, blinding terror. They climbed past the point of exhaustion, ignoring the searing pain in their muscles, until finally they saw it. A small, perfect circle of natural light, the mouth of the emergency exit shaft, a promise of salvation. When they finally burst out onto the sunlit hillside, covered in mud, blood, and coal dust, their bodies shaking uncontrollably, they didn't speak. They looked at each other. 7 ghosts in the morning sun. 32 men were left behind in the earth, devoured by something that science had no name for, something that belonged to the cold, eternal dark.
The trauma was a living thing in the small town of Coalwood, a ghost that wore the faces of the 32 men who never resurfaced. For the 7 survivors, the horror did not stop when they reached the surface. It only changed its form, becoming a constant heavy presence that crushed the air around them. The silence of the sealed mine was deafening to them. They heard the unsound of the massive thing waiting just beneath the concrete, a low-frequency hum that no doctor could diagnose, but every one of them felt in their bones.
They would wake up screaming in the night, not from a specific image, but from the simple, terrifying feeling of being back in that total, absolute dark, with the knowledge that they were not alone, that they were being stalked. The absolute certainty that the predator knew where they were, that it had anticipated their every move, that it had used the tunnels they dug as a natural trap, was the thing that broke their minds more than any physical attack. The human mind is equipped to handle danger, but not the complete, cold, alien logic of a horror that evolved in an environment where light and morality do not exist. The creature's movement, described as a slow ripple or wet, heavy bulk, suggested a lack of skeletal structure, a hydrostatic organism built only of muscle in sheer size, a perfect biological weapon in a confined space. This description, given repeatedly by the survivors to any doctor or journalist who would listen, and then immediately dismiss them, was the only evidence they had of their truth. They became obsessed with geological maps, with the pressure points of the Earth, trying to find a way to explain the impossible physics of the monster that had torn apart steel rails as easily as a child tears paper. They knew that the official report was a lie, a thin veil thrown over a reality too horrific to be acknowledged by a society that preferred to think of the Earth as a resource, not a living stomach. The final bitter irony for the 7 men was that they had gone down to pull black gold from the Earth, and in return, the Earth had simply taken its due, proving that in the end, everything belonged to the dark, and all men were merely transient visitors who were late to the dinner. Their memory of the mine wasn't a memory of a workplace. It was a memory of an altar where 32 of their friends had been sacrificed to a nameless, ungodly thing that now slept, satisfied, only yards beneath the soil they walked on. Every time a train passed or a loud machine rattled the earth, the survivors would jump, their faces flashing with the pure primal fear of that night, believing that the creature was finally stirring, finally rising, coming to finish the job. The world had betrayed them by simply continuing its rotation, its seasons, its daily noise, acting as if the monstrous truth they had witnessed had never existed. But for them the truth was an anchor, a cold, heavy weight chained to their souls, dragging them slowly back toward the eternal silence of the earth. And as time passed, and the men grew fewer, dying of consumption or sheer heartbreaking terror, the story faded, becoming a local legend, a tale whispered late at night to scare children, the creature morphing into a simple mine monster, a much easier thing to accept than the truth that the deep earth is alive and it is hungry. They all knew, right up to their last breath, that they hadn't just escaped a cave-in. They had escaped the dinner plate of something truly vast, and they had left a clean plate behind, ensuring that the next time it woke, the world would have an even bigger price to pay. The memory was not just a story. It was a permanent, non-stop broadcast of pure, unadulterated fear playing inside their heads, a horror movie they could never turn off, starring themselves as the ones who got away, but only just. The cold realization was that their lives had been given back to them on loan, a temporary reprieve from a final geological hunger. The earth keeps its secrets, but sometimes, when you dig too deep, the secret digs back. The simple thought that the mine owner's final concrete seal, a desperate, futile attempt to buy silence, was nothing more than a temporary cork in a very large open bottle, haunted the men who survived. They visualized the creature down there, evolving in the absolute dark, its teeth sharpening, its massive body growing stronger, waiting for the concrete to finally fracture under the endless grinding pressure of the earth. The sound of a heavy truck driving over the road near the sealed mine was enough to send shivers down their spines, imagining the seismic vibration being translated deep underground as a dinner bell.
The creature had a taste for human flesh now, a taste it would never forget, and the 7 survivors were the only ones who knew that the vast, empty space below the town of Coalwood was not empty at all, but was instead occupied by a patiently waiting, impossibly huge, perfect predator. A biological nightmare whose existence proved that mankind was not the master of the planet, but merely the appetizer. That is the true story of the Coalwood Mine in 1925, and it is a story that proves sometimes the best thing to do with a horrifying truth is not to tell it, but to bury it in concrete and hope that the earth forgets what it tasted. But the earth never forgets. They tried to describe the smell to the police, the awful metallic tang and the putrid, rotten meat scent, and the police dismissed it as the smell of stale air and fear. But the miners knew it was the creature's breath, the exhalation of 1,000,000 years of decay and cold stone and ungodly deep earth life. The smell stayed on their clothes, on their skin, and in their minds, a constant reminder of the alien environment they had violated and the ultimate price they had paid for disturbing its ancient, solitary existence. The men were never the same, their eyes permanently wide, scanning the shadows even in broad daylight, always expecting the pale, slick shadow to emerge from the corner of a room, always listening for the high-pitched, wet click-click-click that meant their time was finally up. They were survivors, yes, but they were also victims, condemned to live their remaining days haunted by the knowledge that the greatest terror on earth was not in the sky or the ocean, but right beneath their feet, patiently waiting in the dark.
The 7 men who crawled out of that emergency shaft on August 3rd, 1925, were not the same men who had descended that morning. Their transformation wasn't visible in any physical way that the doctors could measure. Their hearts still beat, their lungs still drew breath, but something fundamental had broken inside each of them. Something that no amount of whiskey or prayer or time could ever repair. Joe was the first to try telling the truth. 3 days after the incident, still in the hospital bed where they'd placed him for observation, he grabbed the arm of the mine company's insurance investigator, a thin man named Hartford who had a clipboard and a predetermined story about methane gas already written in neat official handwriting. "It wasn't gas," Joe said, his voice cracking. "You need to listen to me. There's something down there, something alive, something that's been there for longer than this whole mountain." Hartford pulled his arm free, adjusted his glasses, and made a small notation on his clipboard. "Mr. Patterson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. The human mind does interesting things under extreme stress, creates narratives to explain. I'm not crazy!" Joe's shout brought 2 nurses running. "Check the bodies when you find them. Look at what killed them. Gas doesn't do what I saw." But Hartford was already walking away, already sealing the official story. Methane explosion, structural failure, tragic accident. 23 bodies recovered, badly damaged by the blast and subsequent collapse. 9 bodies lost, presumed buried under tons of collapsed rock. Memorial service scheduled for Sunday. Compensation packages being prepared for the families. Case closed. Except the case was never really closed. Not for anyone who bothered to look at the details that didn't make it into the official report. The recovered bodies, for instance, the ones they brought up and quickly sealed in coffins before the families could demand to see them. The coroner's report, the one that was filed away in a locked cabinet and never mentioned in public, described injuries that were inconsistent with any known mining disaster. Bones, not just broken but crushed to powder. Flesh, not burned or torn, but dissolved, as if exposed to some kind of powerful acid. And on several of the bodies, strange marks, circular patterns pressed into the skin, patterns that looked almost like suction marks, but far too large and arranged in ways that suggested an intelligence behind their placement. The 9 missing men were never found.
The company sent teams down into the sealed sections, carefully avoiding the deepest areas where the creature had been encountered. They found tools, they found lunch pails, they found torn clothing and scattered personal effects, but no bodies, not even bones, just those strange, smooth indentations in the coal dust leading off into darkness that no one was willing to follow.
Caleb, the youngest survivor at just 17 years old, tried to go back to work in a different mine 6 months later. He needed the money. His father had been one of the 32 who didn't make it out, and his mother and 3 younger siblings needed to eat. On his first day back underground, descending in the cage to a completely different mine 20 miles away, he made it exactly 4 minutes before he started screaming. The other miners said he just stood there, lamp in hand, staring at the tunnel wall and screaming until his voice gave out. When they finally got him back to the surface, he couldn't speak for 3 days. When his voice returned, all he would say was, "I heard it. I heard the clicking." It's not just in Coalwood. It's everywhere. They're all connected. He never went underground again. He took a job at a grocery store, working the front counter, and developed a habit that everyone in town noticed but nobody mentioned. Every few minutes, no matter what he was doing, he would look up at the ceiling just for a second, checking. Always checking, watching for that wet, rippling shadow that might be crawling across the surface above him. Thomas, the shift supervisor who had led 25 men in that final desperate charge against the creature, survived only because the maintenance crawl space had been exactly where it was. He carried guilt like a physical weight, hunched over by it, aged 20 years in the span of a few months. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown the memories, trying to silence the screaming in his head that never stopped. His wife found him one night in their barn, surrounded by maps. He had dozens of them spread across every surface: geological survey maps, mining company documents, old territorial charts from before West Virginia was even a state. He had marked them all up with red ink, circling areas, drawing lines between them, creating a pattern that looked almost like a nervous system spreading through the mountains. "Look," he told her, pointing with a shaking finger at the web of red lines. "Look at the pattern. Every major mining disaster in the last 50 years, they're all in these areas, all following these lines. It's not random. It's not bad luck or poor safety. It's them. The lines are where they hunt. The tunnels we dig, we're not discovering new areas. We're just opening up their feeding grounds." His wife, a practical woman who had married a practical man, looked at the maps and saw only the work of a broken mind. She called the doctor. Thomas was institutionalized 2 weeks later. He died there in 1931, still drawing maps, still trying to warn people, still hearing that wet clicking sound in every quiet moment. The other 4 survivors scattered. 2 of them left West Virginia entirely, moving to cities where the ground was covered in concrete and steel, where the deepest you could go was a basement, where the earth felt safely distant. One became a traveling salesman, staying in hotels, never sleeping in the same place twice, as if constant movement could keep him ahead of whatever might be following. The last one, a man named Robert Hayes, became a preacher, delivering wild sermons about the corruption of greed, about the sin of taking what the earth had hidden away, about ancient things that slept in the deep places and should never be disturbed. His congregation tolerated him at first, then pitied him, then quietly stopped attending his services. He died alone in his church in 1931, found slumped over his pulpit, his final sermon still in his hand. The paper was covered in desperate scrawled handwriting that repeated the same phrases over and over. "Don't dig too deep. The earth remembers. It's still hungry. Don't dig too deep." But people did dig. Of course they did. There was money in those mountains. Black gold. The coal had to come out. The economy demanded it. The factories needed it. The world needed power. And power came from coal. And coal came from the deep, dark places where things lived that should never see the sun. Over the years, the Coalwood incident became a story. Then it became a legend. Then it became a cautionary tale that old miners told young miners, the details changing with each telling, the horror softening into something manageable, something that could be dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. The creature became the mine monster, or the Coalwood thing, reduced from a specific nightmare to a generic boogeyman.
But there were others who remembered. Others who had seen similar things. In 1932, a mine in eastern Kentucky had an incident. 15 men went down, 3 came back up. They talked about something big moving in the darkness, something that hunted them through the tunnels. The official report called it a cave-in, complicated by flooding. In 1941, a Pennsylvania mine. 22 men descended, 8 survived. They described a wet clicking sound and something that moved along the ceiling. The official report cited equipment failure and a methane leak. In 1956, a Tennessee operation, 11 men went down to explore a new shaft. 2 came out. They were incoherent, babbling about teeth and darkness, and something that had been waiting for them, sleeping in the coal itself. The official report mentioned carbon monoxide poisoning, affecting the survivors' mental state. The pattern was always the same. An incident in a deep mine, survivors with impossible stories, quick official explanations, sealed shafts, concrete, and silence. Some researchers, the ones who weren't afraid to be labeled crazy, started collecting these stories. They found dozens of similar incidents stretching back to the earliest days of coal mining in America. And when they plotted them on maps, they found what Thomas had found in his barn all those years ago: a pattern. The incidents weren't random. They followed geological features, ancient cave systems, places where the rock was oldest, deepest, coldest. One researcher, a geologist named Margaret Chen, who worked for a small university in Ohio, became obsessed with the pattern. She spent years collecting testimonies from survivors of mining disasters, comparing their descriptions, looking for common elements. In 1973, she published a paper in a small academic journal that nobody read. The title was Geological Anomalies and Pattern Recognition in Deep Mining Disasters, a Statistical Analysis. The paper was dry and technical, full of charts and graphs and careful academic language. But buried in the data was an unavoidable conclusion. The disasters weren't random. They happened in specific types of geological formations. They happened at specific depths. And the survivor testimonies, when analyzed for common elements, described a creature that was biologically impossible, but statistically consistent. Margaret's career ended with that paper. She was denied tenure. Her research funding was cut. Other geologists dismissed her work as pseudoscience. The mining companies certainly weren't interested in data that suggested their operations might be disturbing ancient predatory life forms. That would be bad for business. She died in 1998, her research papers stored in boxes in her sister's attic. But before she died, she gave one final interview to a graduate student who was studying the folklore of Appalachian mining communities. In that interview, she said something that the student never forgot. "I've spent my whole life studying rocks, learning how they form, how they move, how they hold the history of the earth.
And I've learned that the Earth is much older than we are. Much stranger. We think of it as dead stone, but it's not dead. It's just slow. And the things that live in the deepest, oldest parts of it, they're slow too. They operate on geological time. They might wake up once every 1,000 years, hunt, feed, and sleep again. And we, with our minds and our drilling and our constant noise, we're waking them up early. We're ringing the dinner bell. The graduate student thanked her and left. He never published his research. He went into real estate instead.
The Coalwood Mine remains sealed. The concrete poured in 1925 is still there, cracked and weathered, now covered with decades of moss and rust. Chain-link fences surround the site. Warning signs in faded red letters tell trespassers to keep out. Danger, unstable ground, historical site, do not enter. But on certain nights, people in Coalwood report things. Vibrations, a low thrumming sensation that seems to come from deep underground, like a massive engine running far below the town. Lights flicker for no reason. Dogs bark at nothing, staring at the ground with their hackles raised. And sometimes, very rarely, people walking near the old mine entrance at night swear they can hear something. A faint, wet clicking sound, muffled by tons of concrete and rock, but still somehow audible, still somehow finding its way to the surface. The coal trains still run through Coalwood. They carried loads from newer mines, shallower operations, places where the company learned to be more careful about how deep they went. The workers on those trains sometimes see things in the coal cars, movement in the black chunks of rock, patterns that look almost like frozen faces, expressions of terror locked in carbonized stone. They don't talk about it. Talking about it means counseling, means evaluations, means possibly losing the job. So they just look away and keep moving the coal, keep feeding the hunger of the modern world. In 2003, a mining company proposed reopening some of the old Coalwood shafts. They had new technology, better safety equipment, and modern geological surveys that showed the deep veins of premium coal were still there, untouched, waiting. The proposal made it all the way to the state regulatory board before it quietly disappeared. No explanation was given. No official rejection was filed. The proposal simply vanished from the records as if it had never existed. But there were rumors. Rumors that the company's preliminary drilling teams had found something unusual in their core samples. Something organic in rock that should have been sterile. Something that was dormant but not dead. Rumors that one of the drilling teams working at night had reported hearing sounds through their equipment. Sounds like clicking. Sounds like breathing. Sounds like something large stirring after a very, very long sleep. The drilling stopped. The crews were paid well and sent home with strict non-disclosure agreements. The equipment was removed, the site was filled in and covered over, and the proposal was forgotten. Joe Patterson, the last of the 7 survivors, died in 1984 at the age of 79. His granddaughter was with him at the end. She said that his final words, whispered with his last breath, were not a prayer or a goodbye, but a warning. "It's not just Coalwood," he said. "It's everywhere, under everything, waiting. And we keep digging. We never learn. We just keep digging." His funeral was well attended. He had been a respected member of the community, despite his strange fears and his refusal to ever go underground again. People remembered him as the boy who had survived the Coalwood disaster, the lucky one who had made it out. They told stories about his courage, his resilience, his long life despite the trauma he had endured. Nobody mentioned maps he kept in his study. Maps just like Thomas's maps, covered in red lines and circles and desperate notations. Nobody mentioned the journals he had filled with observations, decades of carefully recorded data about vibrations and sounds and patterns.
Nobody mentioned that he had spent 59 years waiting for something to come back for him, watching the ground, listening for that clicking sound, never quite be able to believe that he had truly escaped. His granddaughter kept one of his journals. In it, he had written an entry dated July 15, 1983, 1 year before his death. It read, "I'm an old man now. My body is failing. My mind is clear, though, clearer than it's been in years. I know what I saw in that mine. I know what killed my friends. And I know that it's still down there waiting. But I realize now that it doesn't matter if people believe me. It doesn't matter if anyone ever knows the truth, because the earth keeps its secrets better than we keep ours. And when we're all gone, when every person who went into that mine is dust, the creature will still be there, still sleeping, still waiting, still hungry. And someday, someone will dig deep enough to wake it up again, and the cycle will repeat. Because we never learn. We're not capable of learning. We see darkness, and we want to fill it with light. We see depth, and we want to reach the bottom. We see resources, and we can't resist taking them. That's what makes us human, and that's what makes us food." The journal sits in a box in an attic in Coalwood. Maybe someday someone will find it and read it and understand, but probably not. Probably it will just rot away to nothing, the words fading, the warning lost, just like all the other warnings that came before it, and all the warnings that will come after it.
Because the mining continues, the drilling continues, the digging continues in West Virginia, in Kentucky, in Pennsylvania, in Tennessee, in every place where there are mountains and coal and desperate men willing to risk their lives for a paycheck. The earth is carved open, its deepest secrets exposed to the light, its oldest inhabitants disturbed from their slow geological dreams. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, those inhabitants wake up. They wake up angry. They wake up confused. They wake up hungry. And they feed. And the official reports call it methane, or flooding, or collapse, or equipment failure. And the bodies are sealed in coffins, and the mines are sealed in concrete, and the families are given small compensation packages, and the warnings are ignored, and the cycle continues. Because that's what we do. We dig, we take, we ignore, we forget, until the earth reminds us that we are not the masters here. We are guests, and we have long overstayed our welcome. The Coalwood Mine is quiet now, has been for almost a century. The concrete is thick, the warnings are clear. The town has moved on, built new lives, found new industries, tried to forget the day when 39 men went down and only 7 came back up. But deep below the concrete, deep below the town, deep in the oldest, coldest, darkest part of the mountain, something waits. Something patient. Something that understands that concrete cracks, that metal rusts, that humans forget, and that eventually, inevitably, someone will dig deep enough to let it out again. It waits in the darkness, in the silence, in the cold. And it dreams its slow, ancient dreams. Dreams of feeding, dreams of hunting, dreams of the day when the concrete finally fails and a light streams down into its domain and brings with it the soft, warm bodies of curious humans who have forgotten that some doors should never be opened, some depths should never be explored, and some hungers should never be awakened. August 3rd, 1925. 39 men went down into the Coalwood Mine. Only 7 came back up. The creature that killed the others is still down there, still waiting, still hungry. And somewhere, right now, someone is planning to dig deep.
planning to explore those old tunnels, planning to see what treasures might still be hidden in the darkness. The Earth is patient. The Earth remembers. And the Earth is always, always hungry.